Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we'll be talking with South Asia expert Sameer Lalwani about the recent tensions between India and Pakistan. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Tristen, what's going on, man?
Not too much. It's another beautiful day here in Cambridge, which is too rare a thing to say. But as much as I'm enjoying being inside with you recording this, I'm looking out the window and I'm wishing we were both out there. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, we'll try to knock this out pretty quickly today, then, for you.
Yeah, if not for the listeners, do it for me.
Yeah. Well, yes. The weather here is not what you're getting in Cambridge. We're getting Cambridge weather here, actually. I should say.
That seems only fair. I mean, it's a reciprocal tariff of sorts.
Yes. Yeah. Well, wait. We signed that trade deal now, so what? We should be good to go.
Yeah, but I think somehow we got the upper hand and get at least 10% better weather.
Yes. Well, okay. Yeah. Well, there you go. So, speaking of our discussion today, what's on the docket?
Well, first we're going to be talking about the recent Australian elections, and then I think we'll get into Russia's Victory Day parade, which took place last Friday. Then we're going to talk about the life and legacy of the towering figure of IR theory, Joseph Nye, who sadly passed away earlier this month.
All right. You mentioned those Australian elections, and we want to talk about that today because it fits into this pattern we've seen recently, whether or not it was in Canada or other places of these, the incumbent sort of more liberal party, and I mean that in the sense of like more akin to like your Democratic Party in the US or a progressive party like that, has been down in the polls, but then this Trump effect has taken place and allowed for them to make up a lot of lost ground and end up winning elections. And we've seen this in Australia now as well. We just saw it in Albania this past weekend also. But tell us a little bit more about the Australian elections and what happened and sort of what does that mean for the Quad and for US Pacific relations and US Australia relations?
Well, look, exactly as you point out, here we have yet another election in just a few weeks. Last time we were talking about the Canadian election, where we seem to be only a few months ago in this period of anti-incumbency. If you were the government of the day, your chances of electoral success in 2025 seem to be near zero. And then in only a few short months, we have this, what seems to be a Trump effect on full display. The Conservative Party in Australia, the Liberal Party, had been polling even ahead of the Labour Party before the election, but then it swung dramatically to the Labour Party just before the polls. And, very much like Canada and indeed the rest of the world, Australia was hit with a 10% tariff across the board. And in public polling data, we see real meaningful sentiment shifts. 2/3 of Australians reported no longer being confident in America as a security partner. So 2/3, so 66%, up from about 40. It was 39% a year ago. And 64% of those polled had little or no trust in America to act responsibly. So, a dramatic change that we can really see, not just in the outcome of the election, but in the opinion polls as well. And exactly like we saw with Canada only a couple of weeks ago, the Liberal coalition leader, Peter Dutton, had previously, like Pierre Poilievre in Canada, been, at least at a minimum, rhetorically aligned with Trump, talking a lot about woke culture, talking down climate change, describing Trump as I think I'm right in quoting her, a big thinker and a deal maker. And several of his own ministers went with the line to make Australia great again. And what we have seen is that this seemed to be the play that one wanted to make, say, at the end of 2024, but now only a few months into 2025, it was absolutely the wrong play.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what this means for U.S. Australian relations moving forward. I think it's seemingly good news for something like AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US agreement to build nuclear submarines and tighten up their defense in the Pacific region. Whether or not I mean, at this point, it seems like the Trump administration is going to keep that on the board. I mean, it would kind of make sense in many ways if that's their main strategic goal foreign policy wise is to outcompete China. You would think that they would want to maintain something like AUKUS, but I don't deign to think I know everything that's going on in the minds of the Trump administration folks and what they may or may not do. So we'll see. But yeah, any way you measure it, it's another election outcome that we didn't see coming a few months ago. And we'll see what else is on the horizon moving forward.
Absolutely. Turning our attention to the Northern Hemisphere, now a lot, once again, has happened with Russia and Ukraine since we last spoke a couple of weeks ago. Most notably, last Friday, we had VE, Victory in Europe Day, which marks the surrender of the Nazi forces 80 years ago. And VE Day saw the Russian President Vladimir Putin make gestures towards a 3-day ceasefire from May 8th to 11th, which Ukraine immediately accused Russia of violating multiple times. And this also comes, of course, off the back of seemingly improved ties between Ukraine and the Trump administration. We've now had this minerals deal, and we've even seen a bit of a discursive shift with some administration members accusing Russia of asking for too much in negotiations. And this is a big departure of where we were even a few weeks ago. And of course, there was the annual military parade in Moscow, which saw some of Vladimir Putin's friends and allies from around the world come, and not just for the parade, but more substantively to hold bilateral meetings, most notably President Xi of China, but also President Lula of Brazil. And so I believe there are about 27 heads of state overall attending, notably, at least in Europe, including Serbia and EU member Slovakia. And so, really looking at this, it seems that Putin is using this as an opportunity to demonstrate to the world quite conspicuously that he is not isolated, despite the war and despite the continuance of Western sanctions. So all this to say, amidst all this, what, if anything, can we glean about Putin's plans and intentions based on what we've seen last week?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things in here. First and foremost, when you look at the ongoing war in Ukraine, I think, he called for a 3-day ceasefire, and, Zelensky rightfully called him out for that because, he was having his little parade, and he, obviously didn't want a Ukrainian drone crashing down in the middle of his parade when she is there, and other heads of state that are sort of not necessarily pro-Russia, but more in the playing the middle in this Russia-Ukraine war and the competition between the U.S. and Europe and Russia. And we'll see. I think what is more important to watch is whether or not Putin will agree to come meet with Zelensky on the 15th, which Zelensky has asked for, or be open to this larger 30-day ceasefire, which I don't really see it. As we noted, there has been somewhat of a shift recently in rhetoric and action on the US side that seems to be a little bit more in the line with Ukraine on saying that Putin really hasn't done anything here, or calling for the ceasefires. And how much of that is because the Ukrainians have sort of been playing the American game a little bit more recently and signing the minerals deal and things like that. I don't think it can hurt their position. The other side of this I see has to do more with just like what these Victory Day parades mean in a place like Russia. A place like Russia, an authoritarian regime with someone like Putin at the helm, these types of parades are all about solidifying the historical narrative that they are trying to tell and explain to their people that ultimately helps to underpin the regime of Putin and Putin being in power, right? And as China has their own version of this, North Korea has their own version of this. Authoritarian regimes do this. It's not to say that democracies don't have these things and don't do these sorts of parades on certain days, but in authoritarian regimes, they're more directly tied to the stories they want to tell about themselves, the underlying narratives that authoritarians use to convince people that they need to be in power, they need to be in charge, and the system has to be the way that it is, because we can do these great things when we're all together. And in Russia's case, what comes to mind as well is the historian Timothy Snyder has talked about in Russia this notion of the politics of eternity, and something that Putin has really tied himself to. And it's this narrative that in the politics of eternity, there's always these bad fascist forces coming from the West attacking Russia. Russia is always the victim. It's always fascists coming from the West. And in something like a Victory Day parade that commemorates the 80th anniversary of the ending of World War II, when they were attacked by actual fascists from the West, you can equate that with the false narrative that the Russians are now saying of NATO member countries are the fascists from the West that Russia is now defending itself against. So he can conflate those two things again in a way to sort of sell the story of today's Russia and the need for a strong man like Putin to stay in power. So they'll keep doing these things because they need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there is the instrumental domestic purpose of these parades, and more to the point, exactly as you're outlining, the narratives that they allow the regime to continue to forward. But then there's also the external, the international dimension. Present were the leaders of Myanmar and Burkina Faso. In both cases, military juntas, and once again this year, a very sizable North Korean delegation showed up, and all this to say, again, Russia is not as isolated as I think we often either assume or sometimes are told that they are. And even, we look at this selection of characters there. They are not, by and large, the types of, sort of the sorts of Western liberal democratic governments. But, this is also indicative of the kind of world that we live in, where we find ourselves, where increasingly Western-style liberal democratic governments are on the wane.
So, turning to sad news now, as we mentioned in our opening, in early May, celebrated IR scholar, former chair of the National Intelligence Council, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and former dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, Joseph Nye, died at the age of 88. Turning to my, in-house IR political scientist person, Tristen, can you sort of give us an idea on why was Nye such a big deal as far as like an academic and theorist goes?
Well, Joseph Nye, his work, his legacy deserves the entirety of a whole podcast episode dedicated to him. I think unquestionably he will be remembered. He certainly is best known today for inventing the concept of soft power. But I think in so many ways, he first made his indelible mark on the world of international relations theory earlier on, and co-authoring with another legend, a towering giant of IR theory, Robert Cohane. Joe and Bob wrote a book called Power and Interdependence, which is still, I believe, or I certainly hope, a mainstay of undergraduate and I think graduate syllabi as well all over the world. And this is usually the reference point for the so-called neoliberal or liberal institutionalist paradigm of international relations. Cohane and Nye's work is so important for understanding how the world works that doesn't rely on the same assumptions as neorealism and classical realism. They're able to ask the question, why? If the realists are right, that the world is nasty, brutish, and short, and that conflict is inevitable, why actually do we have fairly durable, lasting agreements in, at least in the context in which they're writing, the latter half of the 20th century? And they were able to show that liberal institution building allows for the building of a world in which agreements can be durable. And we can still assume that people might be out to cheat one another and might be out to just get the best for themselves, as you have in realism, but they show that the building of institutions basically changes the risk reward or payoff matrix such that agreements can last. So that's how Joseph Nye first really became a towering intellectual of IR. And he could have just stopped there, but he didn't. He then took another big swing, and again with this idea of soft power, fundamentally changed, or at least gave IR a whole new concept in order to help us understand how statecraft works and how states can get what they want. And soft power is basically, once again, kind of like neoliberal institutionalism, pushing against realist assumptions and saying, like, look, power isn't necessarily coercive. Rather, states or actors in the international domain can also achieve their foreign policy objectives by way of attraction. They can also do it passively. In Nye's formulation, the US can have a massive nuclear arsenal, but as much, as powerful as that is, the power of Hollywood and hamburgers, the attraction of American culture, is also a tool that the United States can use to its advantage to achieve its foreign policy outcomes. And I think it's fair to say, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this, that this has fundamentally shaped US foreign policy, and indeed foreign policy around the world since Nye came out with the formulation.
Yeah, and I think it's he coined the term, but I think a lot of this goes back even further before he coined the term, of this notion of what's one of the main reasons we do foreign assistance in the United States, right? It's not just for development and developmental theory, which was big in the 1950s, which led to like the creation of USAID under Kennedy in the early 60s. This notion of like modernizing and developing countries doing that will lead them to become functioning democracies and not communist states. Remember, this is in the early middle of the Cold War. But you're also getting the benefit of that soft power of like, we're giving you food, we're giving you aid. In the Cold War, you have the notions of you mentioned hamburgers and things like that, but you also have the famously in the Cold War, like, rock and roll and blue jeans getting over the Iron Curtain, and that being as important as, potentially nuclear systems and things like that. So, and we still have that, right? For better or worse, people are trying to push American culture and values and things around the world. Not to say that this is all necessarily about values, but it's this soft power of like what we can produce, what we can do, and things like that. And I think it's still a large part of national security strategy thinking. They might not specifically spell out soft power, but a lot of the things that we're doing have soft power as their sort of core element to them. All right. Last quick note to wrap up this week's episode. Just wanted to give everybody an update on something we talked about last week. So those of you who did tune in last week will remember our deep dive on the Romanian elections. And since then, we have had the first round and the runoff is scheduled for this coming Sunday, May 18th. So in the first round, the nationalist candidate George Simeon secured a decisive lead with 40% of the vote. His closest competitor is the centrist Bucharest mayor, who garnered 21% of the vote, which will set the stage for that runoff this coming weekend. So we'll let you know what happens. Just a reminder, Simeon is the leader of the far right Alliance for the Unity of Romanians party that we talked about in our mini deep dive. So that's a group that's emphasizing national sovereignty, opposition to EU influence. They're critical of military aid to Ukraine, things like that. So there's a lot of potential pitfalls that may come from this if Simeon and the more right wing party wins on Sunday. But we will keep you updated. All right, Tristen, as always, it's been fun. Thanks, man.
Great seeing you.
So that ends our news roundup. We now move to our conversation on India and Pakistan with Sameer Lalwani. Sameer is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He was formerly a senior expert in the Asia Center at the United States Institute of Peace, director of the Stimson Center's South Asia program, an adjunct professor at George Washington University, and a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation. His writing has appeared in the Journal of Strategic Studies, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and a number of other outlets. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back. I'm happy to be joined today by my friend Sameer Lalwani to talk about what's been going on between India and Pakistan in the last few weeks. So, Sameer, thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, it's good to be on the pod.
So, just to kick it off and get into it here, could you walk us through specifically what ignited this latest escalation between India and Pakistan, and what should we kind of know about the recent tensions leading up to that?
Yeah, so specifically, there was a terrorist attack about a little more than 2 weeks ago in India, in Indian-controlled Kashmir. And it was a pretty brutal attack by a group that India claims was called the Resistance Front, and believes it to be sort of a front of Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is an internationally recognized terrorist organization that has links to the Pakistani state. And they killed about 26 individuals, mostly tourists in the Kashmir Valley, in kind of a execution style, really brutal, calling people out to sort of declare their religious identity and then executing them if they were not of one particular identity. And that really inflamed tensions, or really inflamed the Indian population, and certainly the government vowed retaliation, immediately slaps a bunch of diplomatic punitive measures, and including holding in abeyance the Indus Waters Treaty, which it basically sort of provides for the water distribution of rivers in India and Pakistan, and sort of a lot of the agriculture areas, but doesn't go further. Clearly, there was like sort of a belief that India would retaliate kinetically, and I came out of that. I was in India that week when these things happened. I came out of that trip believing that kinetic retaliation was coming. And then this week, we saw on Tuesday, India launched a number of strikes through air, naval, and ground platforms, missile and drone strikes on 9 targets in Pakistan. They said were terrorist targets, including deep in Pakistan's core of Punjab. And then India lost some planes. There was some Pakistani retaliation over the next 2 to 3 days. And then things started really picking up on Friday, and we can sort of unpack a little bit of the details of that. But things got to a point where the United States and many other countries, I think, were sort of expressing real concerns about where this was going between 2 nuclear powers that were striking each other's territory in a way that we haven't really seen historically happen before.
Yeah, and we will unpack that in a second. But you mentioned some very interesting things and that hint at like longer history here, like the terrorist groups. And I specifically remember back when I was doing the presidential daily briefing back in the early 2000s, early mid 2000s, there was a major terrorist attack on like the military school, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
I think it was like 2014 or 15, something like that. But there is a longer history here. So can you, in about 2.5 minutes, can you give us sort of give the listeners a little bit of the background history on here? Why are tensions so fraught between India and Pakistan, and just to kind of demonstrate that this is just the latest in like a series of decades of issues and fighting between the two.
Yeah, well, I wish I could call upon Claude or Gemini to help me out here with like sort of the 2 minute version, but I'll do my best. So yeah, basically, India and Pakistan created from partition of the Indian subcontinent after British colonial rule departs the region, and immediately sort of fall into war over territorial dispute of the region of Kashmir. And so since 1947, the relationship has been marked by war and conflict, disputes over territory, specifically the Kashmir region, over status to some degree, but also fueled by nationalism, both sort of good old conventional nationalism as religious nationalism on both sides, but based on sort of the violence that sort of like abetted the partition of the two countries in the subcontinent. So they fought about 3 wars prior to the nuclearization of the subcontinent, including a major war in 1971 that basically cut off maybe you'd say a quarter of Pakistan, because it was East Pakistan, now later became Bangladesh, and so Pakistan was never really was deeply scarred by that experience. Both countries developed nuclear capabilities in the 70s and 80s, test their nuclear weapons in the 1990s, and then for the first time go to war in 1999 under the nuclear shadow. All scary times for the United States, for the global environment, because again, two countries in such close proximity, regularly fighting under the nuclear shadow is always a recipe for potential.
Not good.
Yeah, it's inadvertent escalation, accidental escalation, or intentional escalation. In the last 25 years, we've seen about 5, what I'd say, nuclear tinged militarized crises. It happens almost like about every 5 years, like clockwork, thereabouts. You see nuclear signaling, particularly by Pakistan. It's the weaker power, so it relies on the nuclear signaling as its deterrent. It's often sort of either tried to catalyze or resulted in third party intervention, and whether it's sort of mediation or crisis management. Oftentimes, the United States has been at the center of that, or pretty much the U.S. has been at the center of that pretty much every time. But its role has diminished subsequently in each episode, just because one, sort of its stakes are sort of have evolved over time. Back in 2001, 2002, in the first major crisis, the U.S. was just starting its major operations in Afghanistan, so it had deep interest in controlling escalation that was like happening over the border. Today, you don't have the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, so you don't have the same exposure or stakes. And then in 2001, 2002, the U.S. was, it was an ally of Pakistan. It was doing joint military operations with Pakistan. Today, the U.S. is much more closer to India, not quite an ally, but much more strategically aligned with India. And even though Pakistan is a sort of like non-NATO ally, it's not really of the same level. The U.S. neutrality has evolved over time as well. So those are some of the sort of the evolutions in U.S. crisis management stakes recently.
So you mentioned earlier some of the military actions that have taken place over the course of the past week, getting up to a point Friday where continued escalation was sort of worrying everyone, because as as we discussed, or as you mentioned, like, you hope this thing doesn't spiral out of control, so ending it as quickly as possible before it starts escalating up that ladder is in the best interest of everybody involved. When it looks like that's not happening, that's when others really want to step in and end this. So before we got to the mediation that happened over the weekend and the discussions and all that kind of stuff, to the point where we got to a ceasefire, what could you glean from what was going on militarily? And you mentioned earlier that Pakistan isn't as strong militarily as India. Did that bear out during the fighting? What did we kind of see over the course of the tit for tat escalation that was going on?
Yeah, so I'll say a few things. I mean, like obviously, India is the stronger power by far. I think like whether it's sort of in military spending or in economic size, the ratio is like sort of between 4-to-1 to 8-to-1 ratios. So it has like a lot more latent power. When it comes to military effectiveness, Pakistan tends to punch above its weight, and has sort of done reasonably well, both in sort of previous historical wars, but also even contemporary skirmishes. Like in 2019, Pakistan seemed to do okay in that sort of a couple of dogfights that took place. So the Indians conduct some precision strikes in Pakistani targets pretty deep into Pakistan. And they're trying to interdict sort of degrade sort of terrorist infrastructure. I think there's always this language around quote unquote restoring deterrence, whatever that means, which it can mean a whole lot of things. I mean, I think the objective is to get Pakistan to stop sponsoring terrorist attacks on India, and it's not clear to me that these strikes necessarily do that. They might sort of degrade some capacity there, but I like to sort of draw a parallel to or to describe what the Indians and Pakistanis are doing is something like a game of counting coup, where what they're ultimately trying to do is demonstrate their ability to reach their opponent and sort of signal some capability and resolve, but without actually having a lot of bloodshed. Right? This is sort of it's like a duel in a way, in that you're not trying to mobilize your entire army against each other. You're using two or for a very limited elements as proxies for the strength of your militaries to demonstrate what you're able to do. And so India was doing those precision strikes. The Pakistanis retaliated with a bunch of UAV attacks. I think at one point the estimates were like 300 to 400 sort of UAVs like probing Indian air defenses. And sort of both for their positions as well as to like sort of absorb the munitions. And then things really pick up on Friday, and that's like the Friday night is like the day where I think things got to another level of escalation. I was doing a briefing with some colleagues for some people in the U.S. government on Friday during the day, and we thought, things actually kind of seemed to reach an equilibrium. We didn't see a whole lot of horizontal and vertical escalation, and then that night things really took off. India conducted a number of air launch strikes on Pakistani military on air bases. They targeted hangars, they targeted radar installations and runways.
Yeah, that's not terrorist outposts.
Exactly. These are direct military targets. I mean, they claim the Pakistanis were attacking their military targets and their air bases, but they did this with a sort of another level of capability and maybe effectiveness. And then that night, the Pakistanis launch a guided rocket ballistic missile at the Indians. What India says it was at New Delhi, and they intercept it with a air defense missile. But that level of escalation, I imagine, if it hadn't woken up people by then, it probably that was the point where it did, because that's where things started to get concerning when you have like military. I mean, Pakistani air bases that also house nuclear assets, and the Indian capital, which if it becomes a target for ballistic missile strikes, and you can't tell the difference between whether they are nuclear or conventional, these are the things that wake people up in DC.
So that being said, what happened? How did we get to the ceasefire? And do you think it's got a good chance of holding?
So this is, I think, we are still waiting for some facts to come out. I mean, we don't have all the details. We have sort of maybe very fragmented accounts that are highly biased towards the Indian side or highly biased towards the Pakistani side. The United States kind of like whipsawed back and forth. I think in the first week there was kind of like a green light coming from Washington saying to India, you're free to retaliate. Then a lot of concern that came out of the State Department. Then the vice president earlier this week kind of expressed a degree of nonchalance or sort of like non-involvement, saying this is not our fight. And then I think quite clearly over the last like 24 to 48 hours of the crisis, the U.S. got pretty actively involved. And then President Trump puts out the tweet or the Truth Social post saying he's basically sort of like brokered this agreement for a ceasefire and then for future talks. It's not clear to me. I mean, I think the Saudis were playing shuttle diplomacy at the same time. You saw the deputy foreign minister going back and forth between India or Delhi and Islamabad. So maybe the Saudis had some role in it. The Indians were very upset with the way, or at least sort of I think privately, maybe it's even public now, were upset with the way this was presented, because they do not like any third-party mediation, or certainly sort of the claim of third-party mediation. So both sort of the idea that this was, if the ceasefire was brokered by the United States, the Indians disavowed that. But they also disavowed this invitation that Secretary Rubio put out that was to say the Indian Pakistani are going to they're going to engage in talks at a neutral site. Again, smacks of third-party mediation, which the Indians have long rejected, and I think sort of could be harmful even to the U.S.-India relationship. So we're at a point now where both sides have agreed to cease operations or sort of cease firing right now, but the Indians have said that the operations basically can continue if there are further terrorist strikes. The Indians have also sort of continued with this threat to the water treaty, which could cut off, water and therefore have huge agricultural productivity issues in Pakistan, and that could be a casus belli for Pakistan.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge deal. Yeah.
There's a routine firing that happens on the line of control, which is a disputed border between India and Pakistan, and that could flare up again. Those are, sometimes it's small arms fire, sometimes it's artillery. In the last crisis, that stuff continued for another couple of months. So there's all these trigger points that could happen, but there also could be a diplomatic thought, right? Like, we don't want to rule out the possibility of that either. India and Pakistan really surprised everybody in 2021, in like February of 2021, when they reaffirmed a ceasefire agreement that actually held up for a number of years. It was quite effective for about 4 years. So they could do that again. And there's a new there's a new Pakistani army chief, theoretically, that's supposed to come on the scene in the end of November if the current Pakistani army chief steps down, as is typically, you usually have 3-year terms. That might provide an opening for all we know, but it can go in any direction just because there's so many, kinetic and non-kinetic variables at play.
Yeah, and I read this morning, and I guess we should have said this earlier in the podcast, but we're recording this in the afternoon of Monday, May 12th. So I read this morning that some of the more conservative hardline elements in India are not happy with the ceasefire and what they sort of gave up or didn't accomplish in their fight with Pakistan, and probably, to your point, some of the third-party mediation, not wanting that involvement. So there might, that added pressure onto Modi, if there is sort of something, might be more difficult to sort of shove that under the rug, sweep that under the rug, and might force them again to retaliate in some way. So it's just, a lot of different moving parts here as we go along.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, listen, Sameer, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Always good to talk.
Great to be on the pod. Thanks.
Thanks again to Sameer for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.